When Jesus was crucified, he had been awake for about 36 hours without rest. We know from the scriptural accounts that Jesus had a habit of rising early. In numerous passages in the Gospels, it is mentioned that he used to rise early to pray. There is no reason to believe that he acted any differently on the day he shared his Last Supper with his disciples. It is very likely that he rose early that morning, spent the day with his followers, and in the evening he dined with them in what is known as the Last Supper. This meeting in the upper room was followed by his capture in the Garden of Gethsemane and his trial in the ancient city of Jerusalem. By dawn the next morning, Jesus was placed on the cross, where he remained for the entire day. Between the time of his arrest and his death, approximately 36 hours elapsed without rest. In addition, we must take into account the route that Jesus took through the ancient city of Jerusalem. He was taken from the high priest's house to Herod and then to Pilate during his trial. Adding up all these journeys, Jesus walked about 4 kilometers that night, as far as we can deduce. It is also estimated, based on historical records, that Jesus carried his cross for about 500 meters before collapsing, unable to bear it any longer. This extreme physical effort placed significant stress on his body. An interesting and little-known aspect is a phenomenon called hematidrosis. Hematidrosis is an extremely rare medical condition, documented between 12 and 14 times in the world's scientific literature. This phenomenon occurs in people subjected to an extreme level of stress and agony. It consists of a person sweating blood due to the rupture of the capillaries surrounding the sweat glands. The Bible describes this event by mentioning that Jesus' sweat turned into drops of blood. Literally, blood was coming out and draining from every pore of Jesus' body. I firmly believe that Christ was both man and God. He therefore knew the terrible fate that awaited him. He understood the mission he had to fulfill and the sacrifice it entailed. Like any human being, he surely feared the painful death and torture that awaited him. We know that he prayed in Gethsemane, saying, "Father, if it be your will, take this cup from me." Yet, Jesus accepted the will of his heavenly Father. In that garden, Jesus was under enormous emotional and physical pressure, aware that within a few hours he would face one of the most brutal and painful deaths in history. Since Jesus was sweating blood from every sweat gland on his body, you might wonder why he didn't bleed out at that moment. One possible explanation could lie in the climate of the region. At that time of year in Israel, the days are warm, but the nights are cool. It is likely that the cold night air helped cool Jesus' sweaty, bloody skin, causing his capillaries to constrict and thus reducing blood loss. This suggests that when the soldiers arrived to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, his body might have been covered in a mixture of sweat and blood, which would have been a shocking sight. Now let's move on to the whipping. This punishment was an extremely cruel form of torture reserved only for slaves and criminals, as Roman citizens could not be subjected to it. It was one of the most inhumane methods employed by the Romans. The victim was usually stripped of his clothes and tied by the wrists to a post or wall, leaving the back exposed. 2 soldiers, one on each side, would whip the victim from the shoulders to the ankles, covering the entire back and legs. According to historical records, the usual number of lashes was 39. The whips used were instruments designed to inflict maximum pain. With a wooden handle of about 45 centimeters, the whips were used to whip the victim. Leather straps could be over 2 meters long and were adorned with pieces of lead and fragments of animal bone. As they struck, these pieces tore into the victim's skin and muscles, causing deep wounds and exposing muscle tissue. With each lash, the victim suffered cuts that could reach several centimeters in length and depth, requiring thousands of stitches to close if treated today. Despite everything, Jesus did not die from the loss of blood caused by these lashes. Again, the cool weather of the night could have contributed to his blood vessels constricting, thus minimizing bleeding. However, we must imagine the excruciating pain he suffered from having his skin and muscles lacerated by the lashes, leaving strips of tissue hanging down. This method not only inflicted extreme physical pain, but also served a purpose of public humiliation. After the lashing, Jesus was handed over to carry his cross. This act in itself was further proof of humiliation and suffering. The cross he carried consisted of a rough wooden crossbar, heavy and full of splinters. This beam, weighing approximately 60 to 70 kilo, was tied to the arms of the victim, who had to walk with it through the streets, often naked. The purpose was to expose the person to the scorn and ridicule of the crowd. The vertical part of the cross, known as the stipes, was usually already installed at the place of execution, usually outside the city gates. Crucifixions were not only a method of capital punishment, but also a public spectacle designed to intimidate the population and demonstrate Roman power. Once Jesus arrived at the site of Calvary, the crossbar was fixed to the upright post. Jesus' hands were nailed to the crossbar, using a method that the Romans had perfected over centuries to maximize suffering. It is important to clarify that according to medical studies and scriptures, the nails were not placed in the palms, since these could not support the weight of the body. Instead, the nails were driven into the wrists, piercing a point that allowed strong ligaments, such as the transcarpal, to bear the weight without damaging major arteries. However, by piercing this point, the nails also pierced the median nerve, causing excruciating pain akin to a constant electric shock. Similarly, the feet were nailed to the upright post. The Romans were very precise in this technique, placing the nails between the metatarsal bones to avoid damaging major arteries, but causing enough pain to affect the plantar nerves. This position left the victim hanging, bearing his weight on his wrists and feet, making breathing a torture. To exhale, Jesus had to push up with his feet, causing extreme pain, and then drop back down, which rubbed his wounded back against the rough wood of the cross. Every word Jesus spoke from the cross was an act of sacrifice. Every time he spoke, he had to raise his body, enduring the pain of the wounds and physical suffering. This makes his words even more meaningful, given the effort and agony they involved. Among the torments, there is also the account of the crown of thorns. These thorns, about 2 to 3 centimeters long, were as sharp as needles. The custom was to use a rod to beat the crown onto the victim's head, ensuring that the thorns pierced the scalp and, in some cases, the outer bone layer of the skull. This caused significant bleeding around the forehead and scalp. Before the crucifixion itself began, Jesus' body was already in a critical state. His face was bruised and swollen, his eyes probably closed by inflammation, his nose bleeding, and his skin covered with blood, a mixture of dried blood and sweat. His back and legs were a mass of torn flesh, and every movement intensified the pain. With all this accumulated suffering, Jesus was nailed to the cross and held up in front of the crowd. The position of his arms outstretched on the cross created constant pressure on his chest, making breathing difficult. While inhaling was not impossible, exhaling required significant physical effort. Each breath involved excruciating pain, as Jesus had to lean on the nails driven through his feet and pull on his arms to release the pressure on his diaphragm. The fact that he was hanging naked added a further dimension of humiliation. In those days, the goal was not only to inflict physical suffering, but also to strip the person of all dignity. Every aspect of the crucifixion was designed to cause complete torment, physical, psychological, and emotional. The crowd watched, some mocking, others looking on with compassion as Jesus endured unspeakable agony. Despite all this suffering, the words Jesus spoke on the cross were of love and compassion. His statements show his humanity and divinity intertwined. Addressing his mother and one of his disciples, he said, "Behold your son and behold your mother," showing concern for the well-being of his family, even in his final moments. Every word, every phrase was spoken with effort and sacrifice, making his message all the more precious. The emotional weight of this moment increases when considering the circumstances leading up to his crucifixion. Jesus had been betrayed by one of his closest disciples, unjustly arrested and subjected to trials laden with falsehoods. He was publicly humiliated, beaten, and mocked. Throughout, he stood firm, fulfilling his mission with extraordinary fortitude. One of the most shocking moments of the crucifixion was the placing of the spear in his side. According to the account in the Gospel of John, a soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm his death. The wound resulted in the outpouring of blood and water, a medical sign that Jesus was already dead at that point. This scene fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, which said, "They will look upon him whom they have pierced." It is important to reflect on this final act. Jesus did not die in a conventional manner. It was not physical pain or blood loss that ended his life. According to the scriptures, he gave his life willingly. Before he died, he uttered the words, "It is finished," indicating that his mission on earth had been completed. Crucifixion was not designed to cause a quick death. It was intended to prolong suffering as long as possible. The Romans had perfected this technique as a form of extreme punishment, public humiliation, and deterrence. Many victims survived entire days hanging on the cross, exposed to the scorching sun, the cold of the night, and attacks by scavenging animals. But Jesus, despite being young and strong, died after only a few hours on the cross, something unusual according to historical records. One of the proposed medical explanations is that Jesus may have died due to a cardiac event related to the extreme stress and trauma he experienced. However, what is most significant about his death is what the Bible tells us. Jesus was not a passive victim of circumstances. In his own words, he claimed that he was willingly giving up his life and that he had the power to take it up again. This final act, laden with spiritual meaning, marked the fulfillment of his divine purpose. The symbolism behind his death is profound. Jesus' crucifixion was not only a physical event, but also an act of spiritual redemption. Through his sacrifice, prophecy was fulfilled and the way was opened for the salvation of humanity. This pivotal moment, he changed the course of history, leaving an impact that continues to resonate in the world to this day. Before he died, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." This final act, after having endured so much suffering, reflects his total surrender to the divine will. It was a moment of spiritual triumph, not defeat, as his sacrifice was made out of love for humanity. The biblical account also emphasizes how nature itself seemed to react to his death. According to the Gospels, there was darkness over the earth, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. These events symbolize the cosmic significance of his sacrifice, signaling the end of the old covenant and the beginning of a new relationship between God and humanity. The significance of Jesus' death transcends physical suffering and the immediate circumstances of his crucifixion. His sacrifice represents an act of incomparable love and redemption, intended to reconcile humanity with God. Every aspect of his suffering, from the scourging to the mocking to his death on the cross, has a symbolic and spiritual purpose that invites us to reflect deeply. After his death, the biblical accounts indicate that he was buried in a new tomb, lent by Joseph of Arimathea. The stone that sealed his tomb seemed to mark the end of his story. However, 3 days later, something happened that defied all logic and forever transformed the course of history: the resurrection. This extraordinary event confirmed everything that Jesus had proclaimed about himself and sealed the hope of salvation for those who believe in him. The impact of Jesus' resurrection is as profound as his sacrifice on the cross. It not only validated his message and mission, but also offered new life and hope to all who accept his love. The cross, which was a symbol of torture and death, became an emblem of victory and eternal life. Through his resurrection, Jesus demonstrated that the power of death had been defeated. Reflecting on all this, it is impossible to ignore the level of sacrifice Jesus endured. Every detail of his suffering reminds us of the magnitude of his love and his commitment to humanity. His life, death, and resurrection invite us to live with purpose and gratitude, knowing that his sacrifice gives us access to a direct relationship with God. The final message Jesus left us is one of forgiveness, hope, and everlasting love. On the cross, even as he suffered, he asked forgiveness for those who crucified him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This supreme act of compassion and mercy shows us the way to a life filled with grace and reconciliation. Jesus' suffering on the cross is much more than a historical account. It is a display of unconditional love and supreme sacrifice. It challenges us to reflect on our lives, our actions, and our relationship with the divine. His sacrifice invites us to live with purpose and to extend love and compassion to those around us. Jesus did not just die. He gave his life to give hope to humanity. Thank you for joining us on this emotional and profound journey through the final moments of Jesus' life. This eternal sacrifice reminds us of the importance of living with gratitude and faith. Thank you for watching this video. We ask that you subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Also, turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with our upcoming posts. See you in the next video.